But we got to get right now to the Rude Guest Hotline, because on the Rude Guest Hotline, the most reliable heating and air conditioning products in the DMV Rude, we've got our guy Matt Harmon, who I mentioned has been talking wide receivers and all things NFL. And at a take I wanted to discuss with him about Deebo Samuel. Matt, it's good to have you back on Grant and Danny. How you been?
Always good to be here, boys. Appreciate you having me. Yeah, things are good. You'd think it'd be the downtime in terms of NFL content creation. No, completely the opposite. You go from Super Bowl, 2 weeks later, it's all draft, it's all combine, trying to figure this thing out. And you also have free agency looming over us as well. So I've never been better to be alive, that is for sure.
There's a lot of ground to cover with you. For those of you that remember Matt being on the show over the years, talking wide receivers, created Reception Perception. He's writing and analyzing the ball at Yahoo now. But I want to start with Deebo Samuel, because I saw a conversation you guys were having, and it seems like you like the idea of him to Washington. Can you expound upon that?
Sure. So, I mean, number one, starting just kind of big picture, I think it's an interesting offseason for Washington, because obviously the team exceeded expectations by leaps and bounds. You're making it to the conference championship game. But you come into this offseason, and there is a lot of needs on this team, because there are so many veteran free agent rentals that they hit it out of the park with last year, that they need to kind of now decide, like, okay, the Zach Ertz signing worked out really well. Is he a part of our future? Are we bringing him back? Bobby Wagner on the defense. You can go down the list for all these kind of guys that they brought in on 1 year or short-term deals, and kind of deciding, like, how much of this era of 1 year are we keeping around? But hanging over all of that is the fact that they have an abundance of cap space, and I think a real need to make this offense as dynamic as possible. It already felt incredibly dynamic because Jaden Daniels is that guy. And also Cliff Kingsbury, I think, was excellent as the play caller and offensive designer. I mean, him just being focused on ball plays and not everything, all the BS that comes with being a head coach, I think was a great fit for him. So you already have this very dynamic offense. How can we make it better? I think you make it better by essentially bringing in just more pass catching juice. To me, that's like priority, maybe not priority number one for Washington, but it's certainly up there. It's a draft where there might be some guys like maybe 3-4 first-round picks, but it's not necessarily the strongest wide receiver draft. There's going to be a lot of these kind of veteran free agents available who maybe are past their best days, and I think Deebo Samuel would be among those. However, I do think what makes him interesting for this team, and while honestly, like, I think there are, to be frank, I think there are receivers I'd probably like better for Washington than Debo, but why I think he just makes sense as a player that could land there, and as a guy that's difficult to project where his next team will be because he's so hyper-specific. There's a connection in the front office with Adam Peters, the Commanders GM. He spent time in San Francisco. That always just kind of helps things get done. I mean, it is a relationship business. If there's some familiarity there between Debo and Peters, just him being familiar with the front office, that can help get a deal done. Secondly, again, there is a big need there at wide receiver. Debo's not really a traditional wide receiver, but he's somebody that could be deployed well on some of these layup concepts that Cliff likes to have in the offense, quick hitters, screens. There was always the joke about he ran the horizontal raid in Arizona. Obviously, Debo on those quicker routes, that's where he's best. And secondly, they've got a lot of cap room. Like, even if Debo is overpaid and you probably have to take on a contract you don't necessarily want, they're one of these teams that has more cap space than they could possibly spend. So that's why just kind of connecting the dots. Again, there are receivers I might like better, types of receivers I might like better, but I think that's a spot that might make sense for a guy like Deebo Samuel.
So, Matt, I'm a Deebo Samuel guy. I've always been enamored from afar, but then you look at, his games played is deceptive because he'll have that game where he like gets one target and then sits down or whatever. So it seems like he's always banged up. And here's my very poorly drawn analogy. Let's say I love sports cars and I get a sports car and then my job changes and I'm just like Commuter Craig. You know what I mean? Like, I'm just taking it to and from work and up and down the cul-de-sac, dropping my kids off at school. I can't drive 195 anymore, right? Like, is that a consideration for Deebo Samuel? In other words, if you've got him, the temptation is to use him like Deebo Samuel. That means 5 carries a game. I'm throwing this close to the line of scrimmage or doing this, that, and the other with him. Maybe is there a way to keep him healthier and you don't get the full experience, but you still have a nice sports car?
Right, and I think that's probably the way to look at this, because I'm not here to say that Debo is still the prime player that he once was. I don't think that's the case. I think it's pretty clear that he has taken a step back physically from an explosiveness standpoint. We also should, at least to be fair to Debo, mention that he had pneumonia last year. Like, that could also be a part of why he certainly did have that down season overall. There was some just kind of general discontent around the Niners. I mean, this guy was about to fight the kicker and the long snapper at one point during the year. You can't tell me that, like, everything's good in the building when one of your best offensive players is trying to fight the kicker and the long snapper. That's not necessarily a great sign there, but just kind of general discontent there. Maybe that's part of it, but I do think that the amount of hits this guy's taken has added up. You know, he was pretty adamant at one point when he was negotiating the contract that he's currently on that he didn't want to sit here and take a bunch of hits like running backs do, because that's where your body starts to wear down over the seasons. And I think you have seen that with Debo, that he has started to still continue to do that running back work, and he's taken a lot of hits as a wide receiver too. So that punishment has definitely, I think, taken a toll on the body. But to your point about the sports car, yeah, I mean, look, you can still use him and sprinkle him into certain packages and concepts. And that's why I like this idea with Washington too, because he doesn't have to come in here and you got to build the whole offense out of Deebo Samuel like the Niners have done, maybe to a fault at times, I think. You've got a number one wide receiver in Terry McLaurin, and their roles could not be more different, right? Like, McLaurin is a perimeter receiver. You can line him up at X every single snap and never have to think twice about it. You're not going to do that. You're going to move him around a little bit, and they were better as the year went on doing that. But that's not Debo at all. He's a guy that's going to be detached from the line of scrimmage. He's going to move around between the slot and flanker position. So, again, he's not a guy that you got to come in here and say, we got 10 touches to Deebo Samuel. I'm thinking more like 5 to 6, and that could add just another option in the offense.
Matt Harmon is with us from Yahoo on Grant and Danny. In a world where Debo, let's say, gets cut, and so you're working on a new contract with him, and the same happens for Cooper Kupp, there's no takers for either of those guys. Who are you more interested in? And then also, if you could piggyback that with some thoughts on if Kupp's got anything left.
Yeah, I think between the two, just all things being equal, like you said, no trade, no contract, new deal, I think I'd probably rather have Cooper Kupp, especially for this team, because, like, I know this is not what gets what puts butts in seats or anything like that. We're talking about wide receivers, but this is a run-heavy offense, and I think it's going to remain that way. It should remain that way, even if Jaden Daniels is an incredible quarterback. Like, Cliff's run games have been very, very good over the years, and I think from a design perspective, they did some good things. Kind of fell off towards the back half of the year, so that is on my radar. But a guy who could line up in the slot and really do some almost tight end things at the wide receiver position from a blocking standpoint, I think Kupp brings a lot there. And he also just brings that kind of veteran safety valve as well. So really, especially if you're not going to bring back Zach Ertz, which, I mean, if I'm the Commanders, I'm probably interested in bringing back Ertz. And if I'm Ertz, he had a very telling quote after the NFC Championship loss where he said, like, I just wish, and this like hit me when I read it, I just wish I had more time in my career. I wish I was playing with this guy and this team in this locker room in my 20s, not deep into my 30s. I probably think he's back there, but if not, I think Kupp can bring you that sort of safety valve type player. And again, they just have an abundance of resources. So I do think, like, even if you overlap between Ertz and Kupp, he's probably the guy I would pick there.
Matt Harmon with us here, invented reception perception for years. I have been reading his stuff and passing it off like I thought of it myself here on the radio. Always a pleasure to have him come on. So you mentioned earlier, Matt, that there are a couple other receivers you preferred. Maybe Kupp is one of them who you just went into. Are there other guys you say, hey, this might actually be a great fit? Doesn't have to be instead of Debo, but could also include that. Give me some other guys you think would be good fits that Washington might be able to target.
Yeah, number one player, and I have been talking on my show about this potential fit, and while also acknowledging that it's probably not going to happen. So let me get people excited here, and then probably just mention that I don't actually think this is going to happen. But to me, this has made sense for a long time now. Chris Godwin to the Commanders, I think would just be a perfect fit for a variety of reasons. Number one, I mentioned that blocking that is going to be critical for these wide receivers. Godwin's probably, if not the best blocking receiver in the league, he's definitely in the top 5, top 3 conversation. Such a smart veteran player who is always in the right spots. He took on a lot of responsibilities as that power slot player for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense last year. Not just what he did from a production standpoint, which, by the way, he was one of the most productive receivers in the league before he got hurt in Week 7. He was also key in getting guys lined up in the right spots, and that's an offense in Tampa Bay under Liam Cohen, now Jacksonville Jaguars head coach, where they put a lot on the receivers in terms of motions and splits and pre-snap alignments. And Godwin was really the current offensive coordinator, who was the pass game coordinator last year, talked about it as being that coach on the field, basically getting players lined up. I think a smart player like that, who is, when healthy, still super explosive and brings you like an addition in the run and pass phase, he would be a perfect fit for this Washington Commanders offense. Now, the problem is here, I don't know if he gets out of Tampa Bay. Right now, if I had to predict it, I actually predicted he's back in Tampa Bay. But even if he gets to the open market, this is a guy that I would think, like, even though he's coming off of an injury, which, I don't want to sit here and yada the injury, but he is definitely a player that I would sink multiple years into, like commit a big contract to, as opposed to these guys like Debo or Kupp, who might be one-year rentals, because unlike those guys, he was having one of the best seasons of his career before he got hurt last year.
Matt, it sounded like when you talked about the draft, just for that moment that you did, maybe we're going to come back down to earth a little bit after a couple of years of a heater at the wide receiver position.
Yeah, and I mean, listen, it's hard not to be spoiled with the wide receiver position that we've had really the last 5 seasons. Since 2020, we've kind of been on a heater in terms of wide receiver classes. But to me, and look, I'm very early into my prep on these guys. I've just kind of started taking a look. I've got about 3 games charted. Usually reception perception, the full sample is 8 games, which those will be up on the site as we get into March and then into April and obviously draft time. Right now, I'm still kind of early prep on these players. I think it looks like more of a class like the 2023 class, where we had 4 guys go in the first round. We had JSN, we have Zay Flowers, we have Jordan Addison, we have Quentin Johnston. Those guys have been varying degrees of success in the NFL. I think it looks like a class like that. There are definitely players that I think, if they get to that back half of the first round, that I think Washington could be looking at. I'll talk about Luther Burden here as a player that I think can beat man coverage, which is super exciting for a team like Washington that, you already have a ton of answers when it comes from man coverage, right? Like, you got a man coverage beater in Terry McLaurin. You've got a quarterback who, if he doesn't like what he sees downfield against man coverage, he can scramble. This is another guy who can beat man, but even more importantly, he's also a player that maybe he's not the same yak threat that Debo was in his prime, but he's somebody that, if you get him the ball in space, he can make plays. And that is also going to be key when we look at this Washington offense, with just getting guys into space, what Cliff Kingsbury likes to do. So there'll be options there, but I definitely think it looks like more of a 2023 class as opposed to what we've gotten last year or even the year before that.
When you say 3 receivers-ish in the first round, is that McMillan, Arizona, Burden from Missouri, and Egbuka from Ohio State? Or like who are those?
Those are the 3 I think I will probably have as, to me, at least tier 2 or 3 prospects, which in my rankings on the site, a tier 2 prospect, tier 1 is a top 10, like, ready-made superstar. Think about like Malik Neighbors and those guys last year. Those were all tier 1 prospects to me. Back in the 2022 class, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Drake London, those guys were all tier 1s. I didn't think anybody from that 23 class, as much as I like JSN, was a tier 1 player. And I'm not sure, McMillan maybe. McMillan and Burden are the 2 I've liked the most so far, but those guys would be maybe candidates. But right now, I'd probably bet they're more so just the way the charting data looks so far. And again, it's still pretty early. I think these guys are maybe tier 2 to tier 3 players. Tier 3 players are fringe round 1, like late round 1, early round 2. The guys that, Jordan Addison was in that bucket. Zay Flowers in that bucket. These are still really, really good prospects. And I think that guys like Egbuka could be in that group. To me, I'm curious if anybody else kind of jumps into that. If I had to bet, I would say we'd probably end up seeing 4, even if I don't think there are 4 round 1 receivers. The reality is that this is a premium position, and we're talking about some of these names on the free agent market. I'm having to give you a lot of caveats, right? Like, okay, if Chris Goddard is healthy, if this guy is, can recapture his form from a couple of years ago, I think teams will still look at that if they don't get one of these veterans that they like. They'll look at the draft and say, hey, yeah, maybe this is a round 2 player, but there's not a lot of first-round grades in this class anyways. Let's take the stab here, late in the 20s.
Matt, I want to go back to the other end of the spectrum with some veterans. We talked about this with Washington a bit. There was kind of a soft market for some of these guys, in their 30s on some of these short-term deals where they got great value out of Fowler, Wagner, Ertz, and company. 3 pretty big-name receivers, all north of 30, with I'm sure their best days behind them. I want your evals super quick here. Amari Cooper, Keenan Allen, and Stephon Diggs. Might they be a bargain for somebody? And I'm putting bargain in quotation marks, obviously.
Sure, yeah, and obviously Cooper is tough, man, because I loved that trade at
Me
the
too.
time that Buffalo made. I was like, that's exactly what they need. Perimeter guy that can separate, right? Because they had kind of two, I'd say there's like twin towers receivers, right? Keon Coleman, Matt Collins, who really are not separators. I thought Cooper was a great addition there. Just didn't work out from a health perspective. He was kind of in and out of the offense. Generally, was never really like a true focal point. That concerns me, right? That dip in production, that dip in playing time, and I think dip in the play on film too, is a problem. He's probably somebody who deserves, to get a roster spot this year, but I wouldn't be counting on him as anything more than maybe like a number 3 at this point. With Keenan Allen, Keenan Allen's been in kind of like a steady decline, and this is why. So this offseason is going to give me fits because the number one thing I say about wide receiver play, the hardest thing to predict is the age cliff. Like sometimes you see it. I'll go back to Dez Bryant with the Cowboys. Like I was saying in his final season in Dallas, like, oh no, this guy has gone off a cliff, right? And like he really never recaptured any sort of form. He waited till like November to sign with the Saints immediately towards Achilles. And sometimes it's like that. Other times it is kind of like a steady decline. And I think Keenan Allen's been kind of on that steady decline for the last few years, but he's still a useful, productive player. He's not a blocker. He's a slot only guy. I think he makes sense for really specific teams, and it's kind of difficult to identify exactly which team that is. Diggs, I think is another guy who's, he didn't have his best season his final year in Buffalo. I thought he was playing pretty well as the Texans slot receiver, but I think he's more of a guy you want on the outside because, yet again, not a blocker, but still somebody who can get open and beat man coverage. But once again, let's talk about the big if word here. He's coming off an injury. He's coming off a torn ACL, now into his 30s. So he's another if candidate. So, yeah, I think all those guys, varying degrees of interest. Diggs probably, I think, has the highest ceiling left remaining, but is also coming off an injury, which is a big question.
Stunning and just a fascinating market. I think it's going to be really compelling because of all the injuries, the age, and some of the star power, the big names that are going to be available on the wide receiver market. Matt Harmon, check his workout at Yahoo. And of course, he's on social as well at @MattHarmon_BYB. Thank you, buddy. We appreciate you.
Thanks, Matt.
Appreciate you guys. Yeah, super interesting team to talk about this year. Very much enjoying watching them. Thank you guys again for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure, man. It's awesome to chat with you. There's Matt Harmon on Grant and Danny here on The Fan. He's actually a Virginia guy.
I didn't know that.
Remember, he told us before he was local and I think grew up a Commanders fan, but now all of a sudden he gets to talk a lot more about them nationally.
I know, it's pretty neat, right? And not what the hell are they going to do? And what's wrong with them? It's hey, they're in a good spot, which is pretty rare.